Hello everyone, we're going to start with the third session of the AAD Arguments lecture series. Today we have, Rotor and Maarten have been very important. If in the 2000s architecture was something like this, they started to open the way we would see architecture, discovering that all these other processes were part of designing, of doing architecture, of discussing architecture, and their contribution has been huge in discovering, tracking, and also mobilizing the powers, and in plural, that are part of architectural processes. So we're really, really happy to have Maarten here in the AAD lecture series, Arguments, but also having him now teaching an advanced design studio. The session follows the ongoing discussion that we started with Marco Ferrari and with Jarl Halberstam, in which we're exploring the relevance of architecture, and not only for architects, but for societies at large. And it's going to follow the same format that we're repeating and repeating. You've read already, Glued, the text that Maarten shared with us. We're very willing to the moment in which you can also discuss them. Jess Nan is going to introduce Maarten, and then after following Maarten's presentation, we will have a discussion responded as well with by Chris Barker, that is around here as well, and in which we're very willing to open the discussion to you and to have all your questions coming to the space. Jess.
Hi everyone, welcome. So my name is Jess Nan and I'm one of the instructors of the Arguments course. So earlier this week, visitors to Manifesta, the European Biennial of Contemporary Art, scrambled through hulking empty shells of a failed speculative housing project, lain empty since the early 1980s. This is the site of a workshop and installation by the architecture collective Rotor. The bare concrete frames perched on the pizzo cellar were the highest peak in the area, creating a contrast between the crumbling, abandoned building and a spectacular view that seemed like a science fiction come to life. The incomplete construction, the not yet built, had an uncanny resemblance to a post-apocalyptic landscape. This striking work reflects the complexity in which Rotor has been engaging with issues of architectural practice, ecology, and capital. So today we're delighted to have Maarten Gielen from Rotor here to present his arguments on fabrication and narrative in architecture and in science fiction, and to share his work from his decades-long engagement with the questions surrounding material reuse in architecture and the construction industry. Gielen is one of the founding members of the Brussels-based collective Rotor, which has an array of different projects, including exhibitions, books, design commissions, the online database Opalis, and a deconstruction company. He curated with Lionel Devliga the 2013 Oslo Triennial Behind the Green Door and was awarded the Rotterdam Maaskant Prize in 2015. Gielen has taught at several architecture schools, including the Geneva University of Art and Design and TU Delft. Please join me in welcoming Maarten Gielen.
Hi. Thank you. Maybe before we start, I would like to warn you that the first slide contains fast flashing images, so if any of you are at risk of doing an epileptic seizure, it might be a good moment to cover your eyes. It will just take a minute. So what you're looking at is a sequence of just 1 minute, showing 24 images per second. And it is part of a 48-hour long video that we did while working on an exhibition a few years ago. It represents the entire collection of images found on the file servers of OMA. Entire up until the point we grabbed a copy of that server. And so the video is sequenced in such a way that there is never more than 2 seconds of images coming from the same project. This is because we had a kind of a non-disclosure agreement with OMA that allowed us to do this. And their idea of privacy was that, well, in 2 seconds you cannot understand a project, so that was kind of the time limit that the lawyers gave us. And the reason we showed this video at OMA was kind of to express a sort of a frustration, because we were doing a retrospective monographic exhibition on that office. And we realized, even though we were 6 people working, that basically if our day job would be just to look at the production of those 200 architects, we could just barely follow the daily production, let alone go into the archive or read any of the texts that have been produced. And so we're kind of fascinated by this image production, which can roughly be separated in 2 categories. The first one is that of observation. OMA is working on a master plan in some region in China. They send a bus of youngsters, interns, and maybe 1 project manager to go take pictures of that region, and those pictures will then be used as a proxy for the situation at hand and will serve to influence a master plan. That's one side of it, and then the other, of course, the kind of the codified output of the office, that same master plan that gets drawn and synthesized in a few images and plans. And so I think we cannot underestimate the copy room, the place where the paper and the ink cartridges are stored, as kind of the only physical output of the average architecture office. It is in any case, in the case of OMA, the entire output of the office is kind of mediated through this A4 and A3 format.
What is real? Because unceasingly we are bombarded with pseudo-realities manufactured by the very sophisticated people using very sophisticated electronic mechanisms. I do not distrust their motives, I distrust their power.
So during the lecture, I will not kind of repeat the arguments or things that I already said in the text that preceded it, but I will draw attention to a series of quotes. Most of them are attributed to Philip K. Dick, and most of them come from a single text, which is called "How to Build a Universe That Doesn't Collapse 2 Days Later." And so these quotes will be read, and you can recognize them by the blue and white framing. So the material I want to talk about, or the first case I want to talk about, is the case of Belgian blue limestone, which is a material that is omnipresent in Belgian architecture throughout the ages. That for a very simple reason, it comes to the surface in Belgium. So what you're looking at is 2 quarries situated on the same kind of fault line in the landscape. You have to imagine that the limestone is situated in that way, in that direction. And so what you're seeing is them basically grinding away the under-earth stock. You can see the incline here. And the process of a quarry is, of course, quite simple. You cut the blocks out at the bottom, you bring them up, then you slice them in pieces. And this generates quite a lot of waste. So generally you will find kind of alternative uses or recycling or waste management just besides the quarry. In this case, it is a compound that makes calcium as a basis for cement production. And so when you look at the stone, you basically have three qualities. The first one that I show has defaults, which are called noirure, so the black spots. And these are problematic for the stone because when water infiltrates during winter, this water freezes and kind of can split chips off the slab. And so you don't want a piece of this stone hanging above a boardwalk because it might provoke things falling down. The second quality, which is called technical quality, so the black spots are basically a waste material. If this is present in a slab, then this goes to waste. The second is the technical quality. So the technical quality is basically the same stone. Physiologically, it is exactly the same material, but there are these white spots in them. And these white spots, they are not very frequent, and they are quite random. Yeah, it's not that you would have more white spots in one end of the quarry or whatever. It's just kind of specific plant inclusions in the stone. If this block would split, it would probably split right through the white part. So you cannot distinguish the white from the blue. It's just a color change. What happened in the 1950s, just after the Second World War, is a kind of a consolidation of the trade. So instead of having many small local quarries, these started fusing together into what is today essentially two big companies and a few smaller competitors. And so these bigger companies, they started weighing on the technical description of this material, and they identified this as a default. Why? Because their production batches were much larger, and it was a way to distinguish their products. So today you have the kind of the black spots, which are considered a waste product. You have the white spots, which are considered a technical quality, and then you have the A quality, which is equally blue-grayish all over. So when Calatrava is asked to design a station in Liège, of course, a kind of a iconic moment in the city, for which, in fact, the whole block of the city needed to be demolished, but that's another story. Of course, he will not content himself with working with the technical quality. He wants the A quality, and so you have these kind of beautiful images in which the floor is nearly indistinguishable from a slab of concrete. And at the back end of that story is kind of a huge quantity of these disqualified stones with these white spots. Now, there is some irony, of course, in this idea of wanting to have total control of spots on the floor, because if this is the image that is produced on the Calatrava website, the kind of physical reality of this same installation is of course totally different. You've all seen subway stations and train stations. Chewing gum and other spots are kind of omnipresent. So it is a sort of a futile endeavor, and one could actually ask whether the presence of white spots would not have made this image a kind of nicer, or would have made it a softer contrast. Now, this material, because it is so omnipresent in Belgian architecture, it becomes kind of like a language, and we know it in many different forms. And I think this image captures different forms of wear of that material in quite a beautiful way. What you're looking at is a prostitution corner, just 2 blocks away from where our office used to be, and so you can see different layers in the wear of that material. So the polished kind of middle part, the darkest band in the middle, that's where the bum touches the wall. The scratches underneath is basically where the high heels are touching the material, and then there's another lighter or smaller band on the top where the hands are lying. And so it's this kind of marvelous material that responds to its uses in a very interesting way. And so in the day when police is enforcing a zero policy on prostitution, then of course only the stone remain, and in the night you get to understand where this ware comes from. A sort of almost like an exhibition, almost like an installation on the presence of this unpresence. This image is one of the images we did as a research for a project in 2010 at the Venice Architecture Biennale, where we extracted a number of building materials from quite anonymous architecture and exhibited it as such in the pavilion, in a way not unfamiliar to an art exhibition. So the idea was to contrast kind of materials coming from or materials that are slightly worn. We were not kind of celebrating worn down things, but we wanted to show how materials react to the fact that they are being used. And so it's perhaps difficult to see here, but this is the carpet of an apartment, and you can see that there is a tracing in a darker color going from the entrance door around maybe what was a table or a couch to another area, and then in the top left corner you have again a kind of a more greasy spot. Maybe this is where the fauteuil or the TV corner was. And another piece is this white pedestal, which we got from an exhibition, opened up and exhibited as such. And you can see that this pretext of non-materiality of medium density fiberboard, which is kind of like a generic way of signifying in most exhibitions non-presence, that this very quickly becomes a very material, very undeniable thing. So this was the Danish pavilion just besides the Belgian pavilion. In a way, what we were trying to comment on was the sort of the discrepancy that we see between the image or the way, the visual language that architecture is talked about in this sort of environments and our physical environment. So the pavilion, another overview shot, was just that, just 25 materials carefully dismantled and exhibited. Now, I will not explain much more about this project, but maybe just to give a hint on the importance that we see is, of course, that when you deny this materiality, or when you want things to resemble in a very literal way the design, the next step is of course to anticipate these processes of use and to start design for non-wear. And I think most of us are familiar with airports, which are a very typical example of this non-materiality, with floors in granite that do not wear, and kind of the omnipresence of stainless steel.
We have fiction mimicking truth and truth mimicking fiction. We have a dangerous overlap, a dangerous blur, and in all probability, it is not deliberate. In fact, that is part of the problem. You cannot legislate an author into correctly labeling his product, like a can of pudding whose ingredients are listed on the table. You cannot compel him to declare what part is true and what isn't, if he himself does not know.
So I'll speed up things a little bit. This is another project of ours, an abandoned concrete structure, or abandoned, not literally in use kind of space, in which we built this volume. I think this must be something like 2006. It was our first project. We had been talking about issues of sustainability for almost a year now. We wanted to work with waste materials, and quite frankly, we were fed up with just staying on the theoretical level, and we just wanted to do something. And so we spotted this structure. We called a company that rents out formwork scaffolding. They were super enthusiastic. The owner of the plot was super enthusiastic. And so a few weeks later, we were already building this structure. And a good friend of ours, Eric Meriot, did us a favor of making these very nice pictures of the space, and we sent them out to really a lot of architecture magazines presenting this as our office space. Well, we were not an office at that time. In fact, we had absolutely no use for the space. We soon realized that trying to play architecture agency in a space that depends on adhesive tape for its windows and roofing is maybe not such a good idea in winter. You can maybe understand this entire space as a sort of a mock-up on a scale 1-to-1 of what we envisioned would be the space we needed if ever we were to become a design agency. So it's like a total fabrication, maybe a fabrication to convince ourselves in the first place, a kind of a way of showing to ourselves and others that we existed as a group. And what is quite interesting is that even though the project was only there for 1 year, and in the end it served more for parties and art installations and a sort of conferences and things like that, this project as an image became to lead really a life on its own. It was featured in AAD magazine, and then it went to Frame, and then we had requests coming from Australia, and then we were in fashion magazines all of a sudden, and then there was the yearbook of architecture. We had actually to draw the plans just to be able to publish it, because it is an architecture review, so you are supposed to have plans. So we said, well, okay, let's do the plans. And then there was students doing fanzines, and then some Belgian media come on, and then a few years later, Philippe Jodidio featured it in Architecture Now, and it became a kind of like, we are still publishing this project today. Like, it's a running joke in our office. When we get requests for submissions, we still send in this one very frequently, and we still present it as our office space. And this kind of culminated in an exhibition a few years ago. The lady in red is the Belgian queen, and to her right is the Belgian king, and they are inaugurating an exhibition on remarkable Belgian architecture in Istanbul. And in between the models, there is a kind of a very, very small model of what we did. And so you can ask yourself, at what point does this fiction of pretending to be something actually becomes a reality? There must be a moment in between where what we pretended to be, Rotor, and what we are today was kind of like a fuzzy thing. And I think it's a very interesting kind of situation, that you are what you pretend to be, or that you become what you pretend to be. And so you have to be very careful what to pretend, but this also gives a very big liberty to kind of decide who you want to be and what you want to do and what you can do.
It is my job to create universes as the basis of one novel after another, and I have to build them in such a way that they do not fall apart 2 days later. However, I will reveal a secret to you. I like to build universes which do fall apart. I like to see them come unglued, and I like to see how the characters in the novels cope with this problem. I have a secret: love of chaos. There should be more of it.
Let's talk about the lawn. I know that in the US, lawn is kind of like a very important and serious design matter. It's like a sort of an icon of Americana. But over the past few weeks, we've seen efforts in lawn maintenance at this school that are quite incredible, I think. And one has to ask himself, like, what is the underlying message? Like, if this was a design project and there was a brief, what would kind of be the intended outcome? And you will notice that I am trying to kind of provoke some discussions on the school, but I want to refer to a movie which is called They Live. Maybe some of you know it. And the idea of the movie is that there is a character that finds sunglasses, and when he puts them on, he sees the world as it really is. It kind of blocks his vision from radio signals that are sent out to obscure the underlying reality. And so, for instance, an image advertising a trip to the Caribbean is actually a marry and reproduce signal. And so, to come back to this lawn, like what would be the sign on the lawn? What is this lawn actually trying to communicate? And if it is, are we okay with that? There is something I think really interesting in the transition between the not so perfect lawn going through total chaos and becoming an almost perfect lawn. I think in an urban environment, most of the time is so controlled that these moments of chaos are quite rare, and this ungluing where you can see that basically the lawn that was there didn't even have the time to properly adhere to the underlying soil. Like you can see that basically it is still detached in bands from the carpet that it is, which is I think an image as striking but much more present than a landscape, sort of a pristine but of course highly artificial landscape on the outskirts of the city, where the same grass is kind of sucked up into a machine to be then again displayed in the city. And these moments of ungluing are quite nice, and they are very subtle in a way. Like if you go today, you will see that while they are spraying this lawn with water, there's this sort of a brown, smelly goo coming out of it. This kind of orangey brown thing that should give us a sort of an indication that what we are seeing is not grass. And these moments of transition, of change, I think, well, first of all, as architects and designers, we are very much involved in them, and we should recognize their kind of narrative and very explicit qualities. And another example I want to give is an interesting situation that took place in Brussels, in Belgium. So as you know, the UK enforces its borders on the outside of its own territory. So it's France, Belgium, in small part the Netherlands, that are kind of blocking trans-migrants that want to go to the UK on their property. It's not the UK doing it. This is actually kind of a chip also in the bargaining around Brexit. Like we could stop doing it and you would be infested with, sorry, I should not have used that word, but let's say that it is a quote. And so what happens is, of course, the territory is being totally adopted to manage this policy. Again, manage is by lack of a better word. But anyway, what happens is on highways, people are trying to get into trucks to go through Calais to the UK, and so there is a sort of a array of maybe 200 kilometers where on certain highways you can be pretty sure if you see a truck with a certain license plate from a certain company, if you get in, it will go to the UK. And so truck drivers, they get punished for being caught with people on board. They are very scared, so there is these paying parkings with fences around them, and this of course extends the perimeter ever larger. And the Flemish government, they decided to clear 25-30 meters of bushes and trees all around these parking lots. So you can see here a gas station where they did exactly that. The red areas is the parts of bushes that they cleared. And so there was a controversy because some of the clearing happened after the 1st of May. And you are not supposed to clear bushes after 1st of May because there is migrating birds. And so an environmental agency kind of, in protection of those birds, voiced those concerns, filed a complaint. The complaint was received, was a whole kind of media circuit, because these migrating birds, of course, need our protection. And one night we were talking about this situation. Well, it's kind of an absurd thing that an environmental agency is more concerned with the free migration of birds than with people. And so we said, well, this is a very interesting case. And so we took a van, we went there, and we picked up a couple of these tree trunks. And there's something kind of ironic about it, because the one that you see on the left is again an invasive species in Belgium. It's the American cherry tree, which blossoms really pretty, but it takes up a lot of resources, or it blocks out a number of other species. And so you have this kind of invasive tree that is being protected because there are migrating birds, but the trees are being killed anyway because we are afraid that migrants might hide behind them in an attempt to go to the UK, which is basically part of the same territory, but it is not. And so it is this kind of weird situation. We decided to donate these three tree trunks to the VNA. They kindly refused. But we thought it was would have kind of been nice, like, because the birds are in the UK by now, the American cherry tree would be in the UK, but of course the migrant hiding behind and underneath these migrants would not have made it. Another example from the news. The threat level of Belgium as a country was lowered a few months ago from 3 to 2. So now our threat level is not serious. I'm talking about terrorism threat level, of course. It used to be serious, now it is average. So we have an average threat level of terrorism at the time. And so this kind of conceptual idea immediately and super fast translates into physical changes in the environment, because it basically means that the army will deploy much less people, and so overstocks of material are being sold. And what you're seeing here is a room full of mostly men trying to get hold of some of this army surplus that is being liquidated because the policy changed. I'm one of those men. And my eye fell on this beautiful shelter. It is a mobile unit that can be used as a command center. And I ended up buying it for, I think, $300, $350. And it is now a hammam in our courtyard. And there is kind of something interesting, because these material traces that have a tendency, or these moments that have a tendency to exist in a very, very short moment, we can extend their life in a way. We can, or that is one of the ambitions. So these moments of transformation, to extend their presence in the same way that you would have, I don't know, a rusty tank standing as a monument on a roundabout. Maybe our hammam can kind of be a witness of that moment in Brussels history.
We do not have an ideal world such as we would like, where morality is easy because cognition is easy, where one can do right with no effort because he can detect the obvious.
So the same movie They Live, when you put on the glasses, you see two things. You see the real underlying meta message of everything that surrounds you, and you see that there is two kinds of people. One is people as most of us are, and then there is this evil, invasive alien race that is actually dominating and controlling the planet. And I think this is one of the main problems with science fiction and American fiction in general, is this idea that there is the world is cruel, so somebody must be responsible for it. We are not, so none of the people we know are, so there must be this kind of class of evil, concealed, almost geniuses that are in control of us. And I think one of the very fundamental things that we need to propagate as an idea is that there are no dominating aliens in our society kind of a species that would not be part of it, but controlling it anyway. And let me show you Rowan Ho and Andy Grossman, and they just invested in a new bedroom. They are very eco-conscious people. The picture is from the New York Times. They claim that they were very proud that no new trees have been killed for their tech accent wall in their bedroom. And they bought their teak from a trader that buys up houses in, I think it's Indonesia, or sorry, Thailand. And so with all their good intentions, just by the mobilization of their wallets, they kind of have an effect on a housing market, on a real estate market on the other side of the globe. Basically, their want for an eco-conscious cladding for their bedroom is kind of having a totally weird and counterintuitive effect on the other side of the world. Because a house like this, in terms of wood, it is worth $50,000, and it is nowhere near that value as a kind of a house in that community. And so we constantly, inadvertently mobilize forces that we do not control and that affect the world in ways we do not understand. And this is, I think, much closer to understanding how things are organized, this kind of inadvertent side effects of things, than to depend on the idea of villains. And architects, or architecture in abstract as a discipline, its reaction to this complexity, to my feeling, has been profoundly disappointing, because what we see in environmental architecture, and I show you Drop City from the 1960s, is a kind of an idea to control these parameters by going to the outskirts of society. Like, if we go far enough in the desert, we will have no influence, we can decide whatever we want to, and so we can be perfectly coherent and self-contained. And Masdar City by Foster, propagated as a city in the desert, totally sustainable, can be understood in such a way. The wall determines the barrier of the claim of sustainability. Everything inside the wall of the city is sustainable, everything on the outside of it is not. Of course, when we look at this city in the desert, we see that it is not so much in the desert, more at the outskirts of Abu Dhabi. When we zoom out, we see, of course, that it is part of a region, that this project cannot be understood in any other way than as belonging to this ecosystem of, or economy, we could say, that in itself is also defined by a kind of a global situation and a requirement for petrochemical energy. And so we cannot understand the world in any other way than one globalized system. And this idea of wanting to retract from it as a position to act, if that is the basic requirement, that we need to be clean in order to act, and so detached from everything, I think architecture, it will be totally futile, because show me your sustainable contained project and I will show you how it is linked by airports, by materials, by knowledge to other parts of education. And so we cannot detach in the same way, we cannot detach nature from culture as we would like to. The two are intermingled at this point. I mean, we could ask ourselves if there has been a time where they were not, but in any case, today they are, to the point where if we would retract from nature, if we would stop maintaining certain forests, certain ecosystems and so on, they would simply not exist anymore.
Do you have information that there's an android in the cast? I'd be glad to help you. And if I were an android, would I be glad to help you? An android, he said, doesn't care what happens to another android. That's one of the indications we look for. Then Miss Luff said, you must be an android.
So this is a citation from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, and it is. I think you must, most of you will have seen the movie Blade Runner. but the book is more interesting, which is kind of a snobbish thing to say. The book really investigates what it means to be a human, what makes a body a human body. And it uses this image of an android that I want to distinguish from the image of a cyborg. When we see futurism in many science fiction, it is this idea of a cyborg, which is a body that is kind of enhanced with extensions and super sharp vision and technology. And this idea of an enhanced body for me is much less interesting of the idea of an android, which is a body that is filled with technology but cannot be distinguished from a natural born human, or has no kind of the starting point is different. It's not a human plus, it's something trying to be human. So it's to my extent a more interesting thing. And so I think when we are talking about androids, it's more interesting to talk about humans that are conditioned by their student loan. Like, you exist, as we all do, as a kind of a physical person that is attached to a virtual person, and that virtual person exists on servers of banks, on Facebook profiles, and so on. And these two are, I think, this connection between the physical and the virtual are to my extent more interesting to understand how humans behave. Like, in the same way that we cannot detach the tree from the fence, that we cannot detach culture from nature, we cannot detach a student from his student loan. We cannot understand how he or she will function without understanding that. And I want to kind of insist on that point, because in last week's session, which was very interesting, I want to raise a point of critique, which was a moment where Jack said, well, I hope after your studies you go out of this room and you will reject and you will kind of join the resistance, and the resistance is necessarily separated and opposed, and the moment it gets contaminated by the mainstream, it's kind of lost, and so on. And I think this is maybe a valid argument for some of us that do not have that virtual person, that bank account number, but for most of us outside of it, it has no kind of significance. And there is, of course, this famous scene in Fight Club where we understand at the end that the ultimate goal of the main character is to blow up the towers that house the credit companies, because this idea exists that if we blow up the credit companies, we will be free again. And again, architecture, like in this complexity, we have a new idea of nature, we have a new idea of humans, we have a new idea of what can be designed and so on. And architecture is still there, being kind of totally conditioned by the plot. A mandate defined as an area in space, or a mandate defined as a moment in time with clear boundaries around it that are kind of enforceable through contacts. And those projects are obtained by competing for them. Some programs are more attractive than others, and they result in this kind of portfolio of objects positioned throughout the planet Earth that have totally no interconnection other than a sort of a language. And the kind of the condition that comes about with it, with how architecture agencies are organized. Like, if you want to do competitions, basically you need a very volatile workspace, you need people that are willing to work for very little money, you need a clear hierarchy of who will make decisions in a very fast mode, you need a capacity to produce compelling images, and so on. And this idea of modernity, and I think there are more liberating ideas in modernity than that of specialization and kind of dehumanization. I think this is one of the ideas that we need to address and that we need to fight. And it is long from being an easy fight. And I think in the same way that we need to understand humans and mobilize the idea of a human together with his or her credit history, together with his or her kind of situation, that we cannot detach the two of them, I think we should have like a totally different idea of how architecture is produced, and the question of authorship should be attributed in a totally different way. And this is one of the agendas that we have with our office, and we are struggling with it. Like we won the Rotterdam Maaskant Prize, which is kind of a big deal on the other side of the pond. But it had to be given to a person. It cannot be given to a group of persons, which is kind of totally ridiculous. When I accepted this assignment at this school, we wanted Rotor as an entity to be credited with it, and this was not possible. And I think it kind of shows how this idea of the individual author, how very well it is embedded in the institutes that we depend on. So meanwhile, we are 25 people. We are organized in a co-op, so 12 of these people are partners and co-owners of the practice, which kind of defines what we do, because we cannot do competitions if it means that we have to fire half of our office. And like we want to work together, so we need to find another rhythm. And the things that I'm talking about are relatively stupid. Like we eat lunch together at noon, so we all eat at one table. And I just imagine if the canteen in this school would be a kitchen where some of you can invite others to eat a salad that they prepared, where maybe, I mean, it's kind of weird that all of the classes start at 2 o'clock and that we never see people eating together. Like, what does it imply? Why are these kind of individually packed sandwiches? At what point were they decided to be an optimum situation? And we are far from there. I mean, you've seen the picture of our group. We're kind of all from a very narrow social environment, and there is this question of female, male, and everything in between or beyond. Like, this is an email that was circulated just a few weeks ago, where one of my colleagues said, like, why? Like 1/3 of our employees are female. Why is it that they never show up on pictures of building sites that we do? Good question. Why was one of my colleagues photoshopped out of the picture we had at the opening of a show we did at Fondazione Prada? Well, his name was not on the website, so he must not be important, and so he was literally photoshopped from this sequence. I'll read this one because it's not a Philip K. Dick quote, it's a quote by Bruno Latour. But before doing so, and I want to make a kind of a disclaimer on this, and I think what I'm trying to say is that architecture and the moments that happen in it can be understood as a body of research or a terrain of investigation. And what we see too often, I think, is that research is understood as something that is happening on the outside of architecture and is imported with bits and chunks into architecture product. And this knowledge or these positions that are produced on the outside, they start living as zombies. And with that I mean is that if you take a text by Foucault and you study it at a sociology department or an anthropology department or whatever, you understand it as a living thing. Like maybe the text has been written 25, 30 years ago, it has been debated, people have had positions on it, things have been contradicted. Like it's like a living body of work. When architecture kind of imports these quotes and these citations from it, they start becoming literally living dead. Like they are too important to ignore, but we do not have the skills, we do not have the language, we do not have the time, the mandate to kind of develop on them. And so I think we should be really, really careful in importing these zombies. And we should try to find within architecture, within our mandate, ways of understanding what we are doing. And who is better positioned to make a point about the relationship nature-culture than architects? We we draw gardens all the day. Like, who is better positioned to reveal power relationships than those who work for those in power and that see very textual descriptions of what is wanted in a space. We have the capacity to make this analysis, and we should. But Bruno Latour is an exception, like, partly because I was as lazy, but partly also because he's one of those authors that reveals fictions or treats fictions and non-fictions in a kind of a very similar way. And what he says is, well, this idea of time that is an inevitable thing, sequence that evolves, and we have to kind of accept it. Today, architecture is this because it is like that, and that's the way the world runs. We are not obliged to submit to this idea. We can say we will actively sort. Like, there's things coming from the past. We decide what is going through. And in a very literal way, it is something we are doing in deconstruction. So we started a company, but I won't go too much into it because I want to leave enough space for the discussion afterwards. But we started a company 5 years ago that dismantles buildings, mostly interiors. We kind of cut it into pieces that are tradable, and we sell them off. We don't do total demolitions. We only take the parts that are interesting as kind of components. And these components, they ask a ton of really interesting questions. Like, this is a total small building, structure, cladding, bolts, sliding door and everything. To architects, this is way too concrete. Like, how do you deal with this? Do you buy the building first and then go ask for a building permit? Will your contractor accept liability on welds he did not make? Can you have it in another color? Can you make it smaller? Can you make it? Can it be delivered at the right day? Like, the fact of introducing physical, concrete, non-abstractable materials in the building process is kind of a very interesting way to point out the level of total abstraction that the profession depends on. Well, it's also a kind of a very nice way to obtain keys of buildings just before they are about to be renovated or demolished. So once we do roughly a new building site every week, where basically our mandate is to take out of the building everything we would like to have. Some of these buildings are quite spectacular, and we're talking about an area of about 60-70 kilometers around Brussels, so that means a lot of office spaces and a lot of corporate spaces. And we are not the only ones doing this, of course. We, from the beginning, try to organize this as a network. There's about 100 companies that deal in second-hand building materials in Belgium. Some are very specialized, like would do only steel structure, only cobblestones, and so on. And so we made a website which is sort of a Michelin guide to the industry in Belgium. And this allowed us to manifest this as a kind of a network, and I was talking about how this sequence of individual projects defined by their plots in time and space and so on, how this is something we don't find interesting. And I will just show very quickly 3 small projects that we worked on. And projects are to be understood very openly in this case. So this was a draft published by the Flemish Environmental Administration with regards to their material management. It is a sort of document that is lobbied extensively on by all kinds of operators, and architects are typically totally absent by this, even though building waste is about 1/3 of the material stream in this area. And so the initial draft of this document said, Flanders has no tradition in the use of second-hand building materials. It's kind of something we do when we need to renovate buildings, but for all purposes, you can just ignore that. This was a position, of course, of the producers of new building materials. It's something that is quite consistent and quite recurring. So we wrote a letter, which is something we do a lot, especially registered letters. They're very, very effective. And 3 months later, the final version of this document says the existing reuse market is to be seen as a stepstone to a practice of a more dynamic building and rebuilding, and so on. And so basically what we did there is, by sending just one single letter, is taking something that did not exist in the eyes of an administration and make it the example that everybody else needs to follow. And so all of a sudden, these 100 companies, they qualify for innovative research and development aids. All of a sudden, they can submit European research projects together with the environmental administration and so on. So they go basically from the anonymous guys to the heroes. And of course, there is a certain ambiguity in this, because then just 2.5 years after we send this registered email, changing in effect the policy of the administration that we were targeting, we won the award for most innovative company of that same agency. So you're kind of, by taking an interest in these sort of institutions, it is quite amazing how fundamentally you can change them. And this is, I think, one of the essence of the things that we are doing, a kind of ongoing, long, slow, but incredibly fast way of dealing with our environment. And of course, these deconstruction techniques, they shape the language that we can mobilize in our architecture. We were asked by Fondation Lafayette to do a temporary event kind of scenography. We said, well, for a slightly higher budget, we'll redo the whole building so you don't have to close it for 2 years. The idea was, you do an event, you do the scenography, then we close the building for 2 years, then the real architects come in, OMA in this case again, they will change the building and then we open it. You know, it's just like do a teaser. And we said, well, same budget, slightly more in the end, but we'll bring your whole building up to standards. You need a fire door? Here, fire door. We kind of even had time to sort of increase things we saw as qualities in the space in a very simple way. Like, try to explain to a contractor how to lift half of a ceiling. It's the time you draft a technical memo on that, you just do it if you have the right tools.
The old, the ossified, must always give way to new life and the birth of new things. Before the new things can be born, the old must perish. What I'm saying is that objects, customs, habits, and ways of life must perish so that the authentic human being can live. And it is the authentic human being who matters most, the viable, elastic organism which can bounce back, absorb, and deal with the new.
And so, of course, when we are talking about these buildings and cutting them and piecing them and keeping what we want and not keeping what we do not want, we are talking about architecture as a practice. And I think that is what I'm trying to say, is that we should not accept architecture as a standard, and that we have to redefine what it is, not by taking theoretical positions, but by building practices. And the last project I want to show is I was not involved in it, but for me it's one of the strongest projects we ever did. This is a series of pictures that we're taking in a psychiatric center. Actually, in the 70s, this psychiatric center refused the label of being like a psychiatric center in the Foucault sort of one, and they split up, they broke up their entire institute into, meanwhile, like more than a dozen different family houses that were repurposed as care centers, day centers, and so on. And it was a very interesting architectural position that they took so many years ago. And they have a management problem, because basically managing 15 properties, how do you do that, and so on. And so they asked us to help them devise a way of understanding their architectural environment and try to formulate the qualities that are in it and how they can evolve. And so I think this is the ultimate architectural project that we can do, because it is one that is strictly concerned with the language of the building space. It does not pass through the abstraction of the representation, or it does, but in a very careful way with pictures that are crafted to kind of underline the qualities of this space, which are essentially very human qualities that do not need to be disguised or masked. Thank you. I spoke much longer than anticipated. Sorry for that.
Thank you very. Oh, I have to turn this on.
Hello.
Hello. Oh, I have to talk very close to it. Thank you so much for that presentation and for putting so many interesting and provocative points on the table for us to ask questions about and to think together. I wasn't sure where exactly to start, but one part of your presentation that really struck me was an approach to materials and to looking at materials that to me seemed like a crime scene, if I can try and expound on it, especially when you're talking about the teak wood and also the migration example with, it seems like there are things that are immaterial, that are very difficult for us to see, the fact that birds are being treated in a way that can be interpreted as preferential than humans, and the role that the built environment or the material is playing there seems like evidence, like a crime scene, like you lay out the wood or you lay out the carpet in the terms of the Belgian pavilion. And yeah, I guess like when we're talking about science fiction, I was also interested in introducing or thinking through the idea of the crime story or the murder mystery. And I think something you said later on as well, that architecture is so uniquely positioned to navigate this difference between nature and culture and for pulling out power relationships. So if we run with this idea of architecture or these materials as unveiling, how do you see or where do you find these narratives playing out? Is there a certain site, like in your work, where have you found there to be really effective sites where these kind of interventions have been made?
But yeah, I think you can almost turn the question around and say, like, why is it that we don't see the kind of the things that our physical environment are telling us, like. We should maybe distribute sunglasses that we pretend show reality as it really is, just for people to look. And I think, like, we could sit like just half an hour in this room and tell a story about how it is constructed. In what space it is, what sort of people that are here, what sort of people are not here. Like, what we have here is a very clear illustration of what we have. You see what I mean? It's like self-evident.
It's right under our nose.
Yeah, and I think it's quite amazing, this sort of capacity that we have not to disturb fictions that are imposed to us by others. Like, we are so polite, and we are polite to the point where we think that other peoples are trying to enforce fictions on us, and so we anticipate that, and in that way kind of enforcing fictions on other. Like, none of the things that I said are not self-evident in my opinion.
Okay. Thank you for your great presentation. It's so rich and juicy, and like Jess, I'm not exactly sure where to start, but I thought I could ask a question that I touched upon with my students in my section, which was about, I suppose it's about a question of what the role of the architect is, what are the boundaries of the profession. And for me, when I was reading your text, for some reason, I was thinking of Nicholas Pevsner. I don't know why, but there's one early essay of his where I'll paraphrase, right? But he says something like, as soon as the architect makes his or her own design, he or she ceases to be an architect, right? So Pevsner was, the point of the statement was a history of how the designer emerged in the industrial period, from a pre-industrial past where the designer was close to craft practices, and then for Pevsner, he's saying the designer is defined by this division of labor. Since then, it's easy to think of exceptions to that, right? We can think of architectural offices where the architect will assert control of shop drawings or will do construction management. Or we could think of building corporations that hire their own designers. But even though there's an overlapping, it's still very territorial, right? There's still even though maybe those tasks are being duplicated, there's still clear territory. And anyway, my question is, these questions of reuse that you've opened up, to me, seem to exist somewhere in between. They're really up for grabs, in a way. And I'm wondering if you see yourself, or does Rota see itself as architects? I know you have been talking about yourself that way, but if you are, then it's perhaps quite a different kind of architecture.
So there's, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the reference, but
That doesn't matter. You understand that.
I think I understand your remark and question. So yes, this idea of working with non-abstract materials is a total subversion for the idea of what architecture is, and I think that what I also pointed out in my text is that we have this ambiguity when we talk about architecture, which for me is an ambiguity that is that needs to be unmasked. And so on the one hand, we define it as a profession in a way that you just did, like defined by a moment after Industrial Revolution, in charge of the design, maybe the management of the process of construction, but not financially or practically involved with the construction, and kind of defined by a mandate. And so the things we typically think of when we talk about an architecture practice today. And then we have this other idea of architecture, which is basically a sort of a language, a set of tools, a group of undefined people that in theory have the potential to do whatever they want. Like they could change the whole world tonight. And like if you take a very simple situation, like for instance a train station, the Calatrava train station, the author did not want to have benches in on the platforms. Okay, so in theory, the theoretical model of architecture is totally equipped to solve that problem, right? Because you draw a bench, you put it there, done. In theory, no problem. In practice, however, like architects have no mandate to go and put a bench there. They will not get paid, so they can do this once, but maybe not in a continuous way. They maybe do not understand or have no access to the contract that binds these two. They don't have the resources. Who will pay the carpenter, how to convince, and so on. And so we have this idea of architecture that can do anything, which is mobilized to defend and advocate a profession that is basically at the mercy of the powers in place. And I think this is really a problem. Like we should distinguish the two ideas in two different words almost, to be able to kind of cut them from each other, or we have to find kind of positions in the you know, when you have a forklift truck and you're taking down buildings and at your bus stop there is a bench missing, it doesn't really take us a lot of effort to put a bench there, you know. So we are literally in this kind of intersegment where Sometimes it's faster to draw, sometimes it's more efficient to draw, sometimes it's faster to just lift the ceiling, you know. It's, so I think we're trying to kind of take best of both worlds in a way.
Should we open it up to any questions from the students?
Hi. My question is, how do you choose and value parts that you will reuse, recycle, or discard in a building? Thank you.
Well, it's a messy process, of course. We take the, I mean, in a literal way, on an economic basis, it's basically a relationship between effort and value. Like a bronze doorknob is an easy choice. A plastic doorknob is, you need to think a little bit about it. So there's that, and then there's also kind of the symbolic or I would like to use a better word than symbolic, but the kind of narrative element of a certain item. Like, for instance, we dismantled the interiors of an iconic bank building, and we noticed that there was a difference in width between the female toilet doors and the male toilet doors. And so I think that's just, I mean, that's just as explicit as it gets, right? It is like, it's like sexism materialized into these two objects. And so we have a collection of stuff like that, where you just see the two doors next to each other and you agree that the building had to take down. This was a sexist building, you know? So there is this idea of language, of vocabulary, of exhibition, of showing, that makes us sometimes rent a van and go get some tree trunks. We have about 3,000 square meters of storage. So, wow, what is one pallet more? You know?
Thank you.
So I think you closed the lecture, right?
We're being recorded, yeah.
So you closed the lecture by describing a practice that sort of like would be humane and would not need to be disguised. And as students within academia, I think you normally tend to do quite that. You always use either metaphors or borrow from philosophy or tend to scientify moves that most likely are subjective. So my question is, what advice would you give to students who, I guess, are more abstracted, because truly we're not dealing with construction and we're only operating at the level of the review, to how to remain at least true to the interests within the frame of architecture?
So I think I already gave a lot of advice, and like one of it is very simple, like have lunch together, like really try to block out this, like in a way, the fact that you are working on individual assignments and are going to be individually judged on them by the end of the year, for me is already kind of a very problematic situation. Like I'm not sure that I would pass architecture school if I had to draw my own ideas, you know. And why should we? Why is this idea of the individual author so much part of the academic practice? I mean, that's just one idea. I think it's a matter of kind of seeking for niches, for tools, for ways to fight this dehumanization that is constantly taking place in the many abstractions that we mobilize. And I don't think you all have to start doing deconstruction companies, especially not in the area where we are active. But I could imagine that maybe in the field of preservation there's moments where traditional representational architecture just doesn't work. So that's good. You go there, you develop a language, a practice, and so on. And what can that practice say about other more traditional fields? There's no manual, but go for it.
Thank you.
Keep raising your hand so we can make the best of the time by moving the microphone.
You just mentioned Philip Dick's quote about authentic human being, and could you please explain more about how to define the authentic human being? Because we are all going to despair when we are dead. So and how we are now somehow exist, but we are going to despair. So I found the range of authentic is a bit ambiguous.
I totally agree, and I think that is it's something that it's like a question that we can understand, but whenever you try to formulate it, you hear yourself using words and sentences that do not work. Like it's one of those moments where the proxies that we have to communicate, they just totally fail, and I think. At the end of my introduction text, I referred to the How to Build a Universe and so on text that Philip K. Dick was, and he is basically struggling with it. I do not find his answers very compelling or very clear. Like it's basically definitions that eat up themselves and so on. And so in the end, when using words, it's always the same. Like what is waste? What we consider waste. What is the authentic human being? What we consider, like we invoke a sort of a consensus. And I don't think there's much more to say about it at this point.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello. Give me 10 seconds to read something that I wrote for you. Billions of years ago, billions of microscopic organisms equipped with a mineral shell died. The remains, compacted by the weight of the ocean's water, became the limestone you showed in your image. In the book 1000 Years of Nonlinear History, cities are described also accurately, if I may add, as conglomerates of mineral depositions. We are meant to leave waste behind in the process of fending off the chaos that is trying to dismantle us. Do you think your projects also leave waste behind? And how would you like it to be dealt with?
So the beginning of your citation, because I guess it was a citation? No, you wrote it? Okay. It reminds me very strongly about a text by Slavoj Zizek. I thought, whatever. There's again, I mean, we're in very swampy territory. I'm just like trying to make sense of things, as most of you are. But a good friend of mine, he once told me, like, when you're on the highway, you drive right. That means that people can cross you on the left. And so I think this idea of you're moving yourself in a direction, but you keep open the possibility that other people might move faster is very interesting. So instead of taking a position of power and closing the door, it's like taking a position of power, because that's the way to move forward, but leaving the door open. And it's a very difficult thing to do, because your authority will constantly be questioned if the door is open, and so it's super distracting. But I think in the end, this is one of the strategies that might kind of cut through this ring of killing your peers. That, like, Alejandro Aravena, when he was doing the Venice Architecture Biennale, he called all his friends, and basically it was the killing of the Pritzker generation. And then he won the Pritzker himself, and so now he and his friends are the establishment. And so now there's like new people that need to come and need to say like, oh, the proxies that he mobilizes are bad, and so on and so on. And so I think it's kind of this. Again, for me, related to this question of authorship and easy positions that are simple to replicate and that are based on abstractions and so on. And so it's like dismantling this in whatever way we can that might move us forward.
When you were talking about dismantling and revealing, I thought something that I was told at school, that the most obvious, it's what is not seen. So I think it's...
Sorry, can you repeat that? The most obvious?
It's what it's more omitted, like something that it's so obvious, nobody sees. So I think it's interesting that in the Philip K, he's trying to attempt, he's making an attempt to define reality and what is real, but what I'm thinking is that what is real is what is hidden. Is that what Rotor is trying to
I think you can act in this world without trying to mobilize this idea of a underlying strict reality. I think by this time, and again, I don't know if this happened in history or if it is just now or if it has always been like this. I think it's very difficult to distinguish the fiction from the reality, and the two, they are kind of joined in the same way as the tree and the fence. Like, you have to kill the tree to separate it from the fence, and you will probably kill the fence at the same time. And so I do not share this ambition that Philip K. Dick has in this particular text to define reality. And there's later work, actually, like he says, reality is that which does not go away when you stop believing in it. And so then next novel he makes a baby god a main character in his book. And so when baby god is distracted and he forgets about the context that he lives in, things stop existing. So in a way what he's saying is like if there's always, like, everything exists in belief. And so the moment you stop believing, well, most of it, if not all of it, kind of disappears. And so he contradicts his own previous work to the point where I think it's not it's dealing with the fictions that we should concentrate on, I think. I realize that it is a contradiction in my answer, but.
Maarten, thank you for this amazing talk. It was really good, and I want to discuss something that has been very present both in Unglued in the text and in your presentation, which has to do with the institutions. You re-identify in architecture as something that happens in the mobilization of a number of powers and forces, and you've identified in many moments of your talk, for instance, the BNA, the Flemish public agencies that regulate architecture, standards, the Michelin guide of deconstruction, as you explained, the platform. So there's always this moment in which you identify that there's institutions that are regulating, standardizing, collecting architecture. And architecture seems to be the result of a negotiation with all these institutions. For me, this is a crucial aspect of your work. Somehow you're recognizing architecture as something that is participated by many forces, but at the same time, by pushing them, by proposing moments in which those institutions have to discuss themselves and they're pushed to their limits, also you're somehow confronting them, but also revitalizing them. I think your work is also work of preservation of all these institutions by pushing them, by challenging them. And this is something that I'd love you to respond to and to explain. How do you see yourself as an architect, as an architectural group that deals with institutions?
I think I mean, I agree with your main point that, let me try to reformulate it to see if I understood it, is like in criticizing an entity, you make it stronger, because basically you are showing a way in which their model does not work. And I think, again, it would have been interesting to have a discussion about this with the speaker of last week, because we truly have a different point of view there. Like the existence of Grindr as a sort of a virtual cruising space was seen as a failure, in the sense that it was basically a sort of a free space with all the nuance that he expressed into capitalism, whatever that is, right? And so that is a failure, and I think this is like something that for me it's not a very empowering feeling. That basically when you succeed, you fail, right? You should be at the outskirts, and when somebody takes an interest in you, you fail. That like there's like a self-imploding prospect of activism, that if your idea goes mainstream, it's dead. And then at the same time, the opposite idea exists, like I don't know, controversial ideas, they die when they are in contact with mainstream, but mainstream is never affected. This idea that you cannot change it, right? It is like one way, like a sort of a gray slur that absorbs, but the color things that it absorbs, they do not maintain their color. And I don't agree with that, right? I don't think that there is an outside world where we can safely retract, especially not in academia. Especially not in academia. I insist on that. There is no outside world where we can retract and kind of build a new world. This is it. Yeah. Like, this is the space where we are. These are the institutions that we fight, that we influence, that we make use of, and this is it. You know?
What was the response of the V&A, precisely? What was the argument that they gave to reject your donation?
They invoked reasons of eloquence. So they said that they were looking for objects that basically would need a longer caption, because the object in a way would itself would be self-explanatory, which as an exhibition maker I think it's maybe the best argument that you can. I mean, it's a fair assessment. It would need a pretty long caption. So I don't know. I've been thinking that maybe we should ask Maarten Baas or one of like that league of designers to make a little bench out of it and still kind of find a way to get the American cherry tree from Flanders in the V&A. Like, it could become a project. We also have the idea at one point to make a sort of a website of refused donations, like a museum of non-museum pieces. I don't know. The thinking is ongoing. Like, you could say that it's maybe the pieces that are not in the museums that define those institutions in a way.
So when I was reading your text, my question was, what is sustainability? And because we have a desire to make a perfect physical environment for human. I mean, we're kind of like making human more lazy and blocking its progress or something like that, because everything in our environment is for human being to be more effortless or something like that. So my question was, are you saying that in order to have an authentic human being, we have to make a step back and find a sustainability in making our environment more imperfect, so that will open our other possibilities to human beings' progress? Or
so the way I understand your question is kind of our relationship with an utopian idea of a society in balance and so on. So I hope I understand that correctly. And of course, if there was a way to like, if we could imagine a way to do that conceptually, why oppose, right? The problem is that this utopian vision will not exist, cannot exist, has never existed. And so instead of kind of defining what could be an end goal, knowing that we will never get there, what we are concerned is kind of the process of getting to a point where we'll never be. And I think in an utopian idea, you want things to work as advertised, as promised. You want things to be very strong, very stable, like so that it has this promise of eternity. When you think that this utopian idea cannot be reached, you want things to be flexible. You want things to be influenceable. You would want things to fail at one point to be able to show that they failed, that they are a construction, and so on. And so I think that the utopian idea of sustainability with its promise of balance is not a very helpful one. There is, however, a very strong way to mobilize it, is that architects don't have a lot of mandate. I mean, that's a point that I've made extensively. And sustainability, if dosed well, can be a sort of a very powerful tool to change that situation. Like a client comes to you and he says, I want a 5,000 square foot villa. In the name of sustainability, you can say, I think you should do 2,000. I don't know, a client comes to you and says, I want you to do this for this much money. In the name of sustainability, you can say, no, I think you should reorganize your budget. You see a tree you like, in the name of sustainability, you should keep it. You see a tree you don't like, in the name of sustainability, get it away. Like, it's this sort of a very ambiguous argument that can be mobilized in so many ways, and that is like, there's two main qualities: is that it's very badly defined and very powerful, and so that makes it like the perfect perversion in a way.
So considering the changing values of architecture, form to formless, power and democracy, time and timeless, how would you like to define the role of architect and also the project like you've done, or for example, in the future you're going to be facing?
Well, that's a very open question. I think that was basically the subject of my whole presentation. Yeah, I'm having trouble. Can you narrow it down, or can the two of you help me out here?
Because I think the way we're going to define the architecture is gradually changing. It's not used to about space, material, or I think it becomes more about the form to formless and
What do you mean, form to formless? Is that what you say?
Yes. So we used to consider architecture as construction.
You said construction, then the alarm goes out.
And now,
we have to evacuate?
we should.